My name is Ron Crabtree. I'm the Vice President of Operations for a company called Velocity Global. There's another gentleman who's going to be speaking as well, but I think he's stuck in a little bit of LA traffic, so he'll be here when he gets here. So we're going to start off talking about rapid market testing strategies. I know the other gentleman, Steve, is going to be talking more from an advertising, digital marketing perspective. I'm going to talk about kind of the human capital side of that and how you can actually get resources in a country and be able to engage those resources to be able to test a market before you want to make any fixed asset capital investments, if that makes sense. So we're going to start off, and I'm going to tell you about NewCode. So NewCode is a hypothetical company, but this is all based on real life experiences that companies face on a regular basis. So I'll tell you a little bit about NewCode. This is NewCode's CEO, Ryan Medine, and Ryan's been running a 10-year-old Austin, Texas-based company. It's a SaaS company, so software as a service. They've come up with a really unique technology platform, okay? They currently operate only in the US, and they just received $50 million in Series C funding. So obviously their investors have decided we need an aggressive international expansion strategy. And up until this point, there's never been a mandate like that on Ryan and NewCode previously. So here's Ryan's dilemma. How does he determine if a market is going to be receptive to his product without the need to make significant fixed asset investments, right? So fixed asset being you set up a company, you buy an office, et cetera, right? And all those things take, you're kind of putting a permanent footprint in a market the moment you do that. So here are Ryan's options. So Ryan's got 4 different options for an employment vehicle. The first, and I'm going to talk through all 4 of them, but first is establishing a legal entity. Second, hiring independent contractors. And so we're going to kind of talk about pros and cons for each one of these and how Ryan can kind of make some of these decisions. Third would be what we call non-resident foreign employer. And then finally, something called international PEO or employer of record. If you're familiar with kind of TriNet or Insperity, you might be ADP in the US, you might be used to US domestic PEO. This is a little bit different. So here's the legal entity establishment, right? So these are some of the considerations that Ryan's going to have to think through. One, it's typically a lengthy and somewhat complicated process. It can also be fairly expensive depending on, if you use a law firm to help set it up, if you use an accounting firm to help set it up, or maybe an entity setup provider. It's also, you have a taxable presence in that country, meaning that you will be subject to corporate tax in that jurisdiction, whether or not your product works. You have that company, and that's basically what you're subject to. It can also require a resident director, so you either have to hire somebody in that country who can act as your resident director, you have to use a power of attorney to appoint somebody to be a resident director in that country, or you hire an outsourced firm to do it. And that would be the same thing as appointing. You would just be appointing a firm instead of an individual. But either way, you're going to either have to pay for that, or you're going to have to hire somebody that may or may not have a really strong connection with your company because it is a brand new market. And then finally, so Ryan in this case, probably not, but there could be certain circumstances where you may be required to set up a legal entity. You may not have a choice. And that's based on significant activities. So there's something called the OECD. The OECD has a model rules around whether or not you create a permanent establishment risk in that country, or you should have a permanent establishment. If you basically going through the OECD's analysis, if you determine that you should have a permanent establishment based on significant activities, then you have no choice. You may just have to set up the company. And then so you can see kind of with the graphic that we have over on the side, 3 to 6 months average time to set up a company. In some markets like China and Brazil, it can be significantly longer than that. So things to pay attention to. So we'll tie it back to Ryan here. This is exactly what Ryan does not want to do. This is the fixed asset, no testing, he's in the market, and it would be very difficult to unwind that and pull his way out. So we'll look at the next option, independent contractors. So here's the good part about, real quick, everybody kind of understands what an independent contractor is, but basically in the US it would be the equivalent of a 1099 as opposed to a W-2, which is a full-time employee or permanent employee. So if you have a 1099 contractor, you can hire them anywhere in the world, but you need to make sure that they're actually a contractor, and that's where things get tricky. So, some of the pros, it's a quick way to get people on the ground. It is a very quick way to just engage human capital to get somebody working on your behalf, no problem. All you need is an independent contractor agreement, very simple. It is cost effective, so basically it's whatever, there are no administrative costs associated with it necessarily. It's whatever, if you're the independent contractor, it's whatever you want to charge me and I want to pay for your services. That is the cost calculation. So it's very straightforward. But then you've got some cons, and so there's a bunch of data and literature out there that says, both in the US and abroad, contractors are not as loyal as full-time employees. And so if you're trying to enter a new market, there can be misaligned, expectations is the right word, but there can be misaligned understandings over or agendas between you as the company and the independent contractor as your human capital on the ground. And so, it's not a very sticky relationship. And there's companies face this with working with independent contractors all the time. And then there's serious misclassification risks. So when you do an analysis, just like we do in the US, you actually have to meet the definition of being an independent contractor. A lot of times where one of the biggest things that can trigger this kind of misclassification is that the independent contractor doesn't have more than one client. So when you're thinking about an independent contractor, think about somebody who's coming to paint your house, right? You're not supplying the materials, you're not telling them how to paint the house, you're basically telling them what part of the house needs to be painted and what color you want it painted. They take care of the rest. But then they're also going to move on to the next person's house, and the next person's house, and the next person's house. And so each one of them is a client of that painter. In this context, generally speaking abroad, the independent contractor only has one client, and therefore, under the definition, they would not be an independent contractor. So if you have misclassification risks, that what will end up happening is that governments will come after you for unpaid taxes that you should have been withholding from a regular employee. They'll come after you for unpaid Social Security contributions to social health programs, pension schemes, those sorts of things that you should have been contributing to as a full-time employee. And so that's where, if you kind of see the graph over there on the right, or the graphic over there on the right, that's where you see potential fines can reach up to $350,000 based on one misclassified employee, right? So it can get pretty steep pretty fast if this isn't properly defined. So bringing it back around to Ryan, potentially reasonable option for Ryan, but he's a little concerned about these compliance risks, right? That's a very hairy situation that he's getting himself into. So next one we have is non-resident foreign employer. So with non-resident foreign employer, the first thing to know is it is a quick solution. So to be able to summarize it, as a company, if you want to employ somebody in another country, you can register a tax ID number. That's all you have to do, and you become a non-resident foreign employer. In whatever market that is, where you're the NRE, non-resident employer, you are not subject to corporate tax. But you do have to file taxes in that country. So you have to send in an annual filing that says, I am not subject to corporate tax, right? And then the government does an analysis on it that says, correct, you're not subject to corporate tax. So it is a fairly streamlined solution. The trick is that it's fairly regionally concentrated too. So really, most of the time, NREs only exist in Europe. And it's because of the EU and kind of the freedom of movement between companies and employees and all those sorts of things. APAC is starting, or some parts of Asia are starting to kind of look at this concept and kick around the idea, but for the most part, it's really just focused in Europe. So you're kind of restricted about where you can use an NRE around the world. It's technically not a taxable presence, which is what I was mentioning previously, where you just are registering a tax ID number, but you're not technically subject to corporate tax in the country where you're an NRE. And it's complex from an administrative perspective and a compliance perspective. So basically what that administrative side of being able to prove to the government that you are not subject to corporate taxes is is really kind of it can be an extremely heavy administrative burden if you're not used to dealing with something like that. And also, remember, you're taking away corporate taxes from that government. So they have an incentive to make sure that you're doing everything exactly by the book because they're losing corporate taxes from you. So that's why it can be really tricky and really big headache from an administrative perspective. But for Ryan, in Europe, this could be a very reasonable solution for him, right? So that's kind of, it's very straightforward. The only downside in this particular fact pattern is that it only restricts Ryan to really be able to use this solution in one region of the world. It doesn't help him in Asia really, it doesn't help him in Africa, it doesn't help him in Latin. And then finally, international PEO or employer of record. So just to kind of summarize what this is, you don't have to set, so you want to engage human capital in a country. You want to hire them as permanent employees or W-2 style employees like we would in the US, but you don't want to set up a legal entity in that country. So what you do is you'll engage a firm that provides international PEO or employer of record services. They'll hire the employee on your behalf and then provide all the back office administration for that employee. So all of the HR regulations, payroll, income tax withholdings, social program contributions, all those sorts of things. It is a pretty quick and flexible solution. A lot of times this can be a matter of days or weeks if you're hiring a local national, you're hiring a foreign national or sending an expatriate to go work in a particular country. You're subject to immigration laws, but otherwise it can be fairly fast. It addresses those compliance issues that we're talking about with contractors. So it's one of the ways to engage a person, but as a permanent employee without a company, and so it takes away all those misclassification risks. You no longer have to deal with an independent contractor analysis and figure out whether or not the contractor actually meets the definition. So it's a pretty helpful way to do that. Significantly reduces permanent establishment risk because you really don't have a presence in the market. There's not a whole lot for the government to look at and say, yeah, actually under the OECD definitions, you are a permanent establishment, or you should have a permanent establishment in this market. Couple of downsides though to PEO. So one of them is you can't hold fixed assets. So if you're setting up a manufacturing plant, PEO is not going to help you. You cannot hold a manufacturing plant. If you're trying to hold a lot of product or you're trying to import product without having a distributor, PEO can't help you either. So in a lot of cases, if you're trying to use international PEO or employer of record and you're selling tangible goods, you need to set up that distribution relationship. And then you can use PEO to have distribution managers or distributor managers kind of keep an eye on your distributors and make sure that they're doing what you would like them to do for your product. So based on that, and given kind of the aggressive international expansion demands by Ryan's investors, this could be a really reasonable solution for Ryan globally. The other thing that's interesting about these four options is that they're not mutually exclusive. So in certain cases, this could be a very good scenario where Ryan decides to use international PEO for Latin America, but NRE for Europe. Or after a period of time, if the activities grow so large under international PEO, then maybe Ryan sets up the legal entity, right? So these solutions are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So let's talk about some additional compliance considerations that Ryan, since he's only been working in the US, that Ryan is going to have to deal with. First, GDPR compliance. That's a really big one. I don't know, just by show of hands, how many of you guys know what GDPR is? Okay, we got one. All right, good. Okay, so GDPR is the data privacy law that just came out of the EU. And it's kind of changed the whole landscape around the way that privacy is treated and people's individual data is treated. The interesting thing is that GDPR is extremely broad. So all it says is you are subject to GDPR if you do any business in Europe whatsoever. Whether you have a customer there, whether you are employing an EU citizen, whether you're engaged with an EU contractor, you are subject to GDPR. So it has reached out to almost the entire world. So this is something that definitely Ryan needs to be thinking about as he's expanding around the world. And he should just go ahead and become familiar with GDPR right now because it does touch the US, and it is such a broad jurisdictional umbrella, if you will, that there's essentially no way to get around it. Kind of the next one, and because Ryan's really looking at this employer of record international PEO model, is what's called AUG. So these are two different types of employment laws. One of them, AUG, is in Germany. Portage is the other one, and that's in France. In Germany, what it says is it's one of the first laws ever written in the world that takes a direct approach to essentially outsourced permanent employees. And what the AUG law says, among other things, is that if you are going to engage an employee under an outsourced model, you can only do it for 18 months. And at that, once the 18 months runs up, you have to set up a company in Germany. So this is one of those reasons where, Ryan's going to have to start thinking, if he wants to work in Germany, he's going to have to start thinking about setting up that company 18 months out, because he knows he only has a very short window to be able to do this. And then portage is interesting. So in France, portage is basically an aggregator of independent contractors. So in France, it's not illegal to be self-employed, but without working with a portage company, if you're self-employed, you can't get the proper documentation to be able to prove that you're self-employed. So it's kind of a weird balance. But basically with portage, it gets really, if you're going to use international PEO or employer of record, you also need to be kind of under that portage structure. And what gets really tricky is technically you're not allowed to employ salespeople under a portage model, or the ground is very gray over whether or not you're allowed to employ salespeople. So it's one of those things that really Ryan needs to keep a good eye on and pay very good attention to, and Ryan's compliance officers, potentially local counsel, need to advise him really well about who and when he can engage certain types of roles if he's working in France. Another one is issuance of stock options under the PEO or under the employer of record model. So it's, Ryan's a tech company, so obviously compensation is based in stock, right? That's become it's part of kind of similar model of a lot of different tech companies out there. So in this case, since the employees who work under an international PEO model are not direct employees of Ryan, he needs to make sure that the stock options grant that his company has allows them to grant stock to people outside of just direct employees. That's the key. So if they can grant stock to whomever the company deems worthy, or board of advisors, independent contractors, etc., then it doesn't matter which model you use, you can still grant stock under any of those flexible employment solution models that I mentioned. So pretty interesting, but definitely something to pay attention to if a significant amount of your employees' compensation comes via stock options. And then work visa sponsorship. So if you set up a legal entity, you have to be able to sponsor those employees on your own. And there's a lot of countries out there that say if you're a brand new company, you can't sponsor an employee right away, or they have to be a certain level. So they may have to be a managing director. You can't get kind of a mid-level manager sent over to another country if you're brand new in that country. Under at least the international PEO model and potentially the NRE model, it's a little bit easier to get. First of all, you can have other companies sponsor on your behalf. And so that's a really interesting way to get expatriates kind of moving around the world and being able to have the right employees show up at the right time. Based on that sponsorship. So that's just one other kind of advantage that Ryan's looking at when he's seeing kind of the NRE, independent contractor doesn't matter so much because you're not really looking for somebody local on the ground. You're looking for somebody who knows your business when you start moving expatriates around the world. So here's NewCode's path forward. They have this aggressive international expansion plans. They're going to multiple countries in a variety of regions, right? They want to test these markets, and if they don't work, they want to be able to get out without having to unwind a company or spend 3x of what the setup cost was in the first place. They still want to be compliance minded. They want to make sure that they're not violating anything or kind of deliberately flouting certain regulatory aspects in the country. And then they want to rely on expertise. Ryan's never done this before. So he really wants somebody who can say, here's the steps you need to take. Here's the things that you don't know right now that you really should be thinking about. And that's really important. So what's Ryan's next steps? Ryan has decided that he is going to present an international PEO or employer of record solution to his board of directors and recommend that and say, this is the best way for us to start testing. Let's figure out where our product is going to work first, and then we'll go kind of full-throated effort into that market. So I just wanted to give you kind of a real-life example. There's a company that we know called Datadog. Datadog is a high-growth technology company based in New York City, actually based in Manhattan, and it's a monitoring service for cloud applications, right? So what Datadog did was they started off, they knew they had literally had an aggressive international expansion strategy, and they started off in Ireland. And they started off under an international PEO, employer of record model with 2 employees. And then they grew that office to about 20, 25, 30 employees, and then finally they set up the entity. And then what they did was it was wash, rinse, and repeat. They decided to do that again. Go to Singapore, start setting up. You start with 2 or 3 employees, the market starts to work for you, and then you hit a critical mass around 2025, you set up the legal entity. So they've just been it's a very formulaic approach that they take to kind of this international growth strategy around the world. And it's really paid off for them. I mean, they're doing phenomenal. Take a look at if you've never heard of them before. But they use this model in a very formulaic way, as I mentioned, to just kind of really systematically expand into new markets and grow those new markets. I think that's about it for me. So thank you very much for your attention, and it was great to speak with all of you. Steve?
Hey everyone, I'm Steve Weiss, I'm CEO of a company called Mute 6. We specialize in specifically digital marketing and selling products internationally. How do you start off selling products in the United States and then figure out how to open up your products to new markets? Just a show of hands, has anyone ever sold any products internationally or done any international digital marketing? Obviously there's a lot that goes into it, I say. You have to really, the first thing I'm going to talk about is supply chain. So, number one, shipping and fulfillment of products in other countries. There's a lot that goes into really understanding how to get around, specific costs that go into import-export. Working with a really good 3PL or a producer that could actually, that understands logistics, because if you don't, you're going to actually spend a lot of extra money on getting your products into, say, different areas of Europe, obviously Asia. If you don't have good connections in that specific country, you're going to really have to figure out, how to make the unit economics work from spending money on digital ads to actually fulfilling it. Number two, anyone in here run any type of digital ads on a daily basis, Facebook ads or Google ads? So number two, before you make this giant investment internationally, we always recommend to just start testing out Facebook ad audiences in those countries before you actually want to sell product. You can make a lot of investment in those places without actually seeing a good ROI if you try to just open it up immediately. So we have a whole testing strategy in-house where we'll literally start building a specific landing page for a country. And then we'll start, driving paid traffic to that landing page at very small budgets, just to see if there's user traction or a good ROI, and see if there's this specific product cures a solution in that country. The goal is you always want to figure out if there's a product market fit in a specific country before you actually invest into the shipping, logistics, and obviously everything else that goes into that country. Obviously, language barriers. Being able to provide customer support for a specific product. These are all kind of unknowns that you go through when you go into a new place that you've never sold your product in. Last but not least, how do what goes into the launch? All right, you have product market traction in these specific countries. You're starting to test out Facebook ads. Obviously, we recommend Facebook before Google search or some of these other traffic channels. What's the next steps? How do you scale in that specific country? How do you, from a supply chain, how do you put, product in specific areas where you can get it to the consumer? And then last but not least, how do you figure out which markets to go into. Number one, Australia. I always look at, if I'm doing e-commerce, I want to go to markets where Amazon isn't yet. That's a big thing. Australia, great example. Amazon has yet to have a big footprint in Australia, so that means there's a big opportunity for brands to go into Australia and provide solutions to problems that exist. So obviously I'm looking at Australia, so next step is I build a specific landing page just for Australia traffic. I see that there's product market fit for my product in Australia. Let's say I'm selling a cosmetics brand product. Number two is I start looking for suppliers. Start looking at how do I get a supply chain set up in Australia. I'm talking to local manufacturers there, local warehouses. I really want to figure out how I can get products there as quickly as humanly possible. And last but not least, it's just execution. It's literally figuring out how to be profitable from a return on investment, a return on ads in Australia. And that's pretty much how we really combat going into new international markets with products. We're very digital focused, we're very scrappy, and we try and move as quickly as humanly possible to really get these products in as many people's hands as possible. That's pretty much all I have. Anyone have any questions before I wrap up? Good.
So just two, I guess, are kind of related. One is, off the top of your head, you said Amazon's and avoid Amazon. So what are their lead markets where they are? And do you have any insight on why they're not in those other markets?
I mean, they're coming.
Okay.
So I would say there's no practical business reason why they're not in those markets, but Australia, India, those are two markets that Amazon is trying to get into. Obviously, Amazon has sites set international; it's a big priority. So being able to get into those markets with your products before Amazon gets in there is really amazing because they just don't have a lot of solutions for problems that we have in the States. The best products in the States usually get to these markets 6 months to a year after, and with Amazon that lead time is going to go down from 6 months to probably a month. So it's really important to understand who your competition is in those specific countries.